Friedrich Nietzsche was never one to shy away from controversy. His writings often stirred outrage, not because they were meaningless provocations, but because they revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature. Among his most shocking ideas were his thoughts on women, which many dismissed as misogynistic. But what if Nietzsche wasn't talking about all women? What if he was pointing out a dangerous pattern in some, a shadow side of femininity that society refused to acknowledge? In this video, we dive deep into the forgotten pages of Nietzsche's philosophy to uncover what he really meant and why no one dared to listen. Friedrich Nietzsche's views on women are among the most controversial in all of philosophy, and they are often quoted without context or nuance. Many dismiss him as a misogynist, quick to label his words as hateful or outdated. But to truly understand what Nietzsche was saying, we have to look deeper into his experiences and his philosophical mission. Nietzsche was not writing to flatter anyone, man or woman. He was writing to expose illusions, to strip away comforting lies, and confront the raw, often uncomfortable truth. And in that pursuit, he turned his critical gaze not just on society at large or religion, but on the institution of romantic love and the pedestal upon which women were often placed. Nietzsche's own life was shaped by complex experiences with women. Raised in a household dominated by women after his father died young, he was intimately familiar with feminine influence from an early age. As he grew older, Nietzsche never married. His one known romantic proposal to the brilliant Lou Andreas Salome was rejected. This experience left a scar, but it also provided fuel for philosophical reflection. Nietzsche saw something in romantic relationships that disturbed him, a discrepancy between the image of women promoted by society and the reality he observed. He criticized how men often projected an idealized, almost divine image onto women, something he believed was not only false, but dangerous. In his view, men who did this were not truly loving a person, but a fantasy. And this fantasy gave certain women the power to manipulate, deceive, and control without ever being held accountable. Nietzsche wasn't targeting all women. He was attacking the idealization of women, which he saw as a form of self-deception that ultimately weakened men and poisoned relationships. He argued that many men, in their weakness, voluntarily submitted to this ideal, creating a dynamic of dependence and subjugation. These men didn't want strong, thinking women. They wanted symbols of comfort, emotional security, and innocence. And in doing so, they invited their own downfall. Nietzsche saw this as a form of spiritual corruption. When a man gives up his strength, his reason, and his individuality in order to be loved, he loses himself. This was not hatred of women. It was hatred of the illusion that turns love into slavery. For Nietzsche, true strength comes from overcoming illusions, not indulging in them. He demanded that men wake up from their romantic dreams and confront the reality of power, desire, and self-respect. His warnings were not about hating women, they were about freeing men from worshipping a false image of them. But society wasn't ready to hear that. They weren't prepared to dismantle the fantasy, and so they dismissed him as bitter, or insane, or hateful, when in fact, he may have been one of the few courageous enough to speak the truth. Nietzsche believed that behind the veil of courtship and romance, there was something far more primal at work: power. To him, relationships between men and women were often not driven by mutual respect or equality, but by a struggle for control. And in this struggle, Nietzsche saw some women as wielding a particularly effective and dangerous weapon: seduction. But not seduction as a playful game or harmless flirtation. He viewed it as a calculated means of domination, a way of gaining power without appearing to seek it. Where men might fight with fists or strategy, Nietzsche suggested that some women fought with charm, allure, and emotional manipulation. In his eyes, the seductress was not a romantic figure, but a predator, able to cloak ambition under the guise of love. The smile, the glance, the vulnerable tone of voice. These were not innocent tools, but methods of persuasion crafted to lower a man's defenses. Nietzsche saw this type of power as particularly insidious because it didn't announce itself. It didn't come with a sword or a declaration. It came as affection, as desire, as need. And that made it far more dangerous. He was especially critical of men who fell into this trap willingly, surrendering their will in exchange for intimacy or emotional validation. For Nietzsche, a man who abandoned his independence in the name of romantic love was a man who had already lost. He saw this as a betrayal of the will to power, the very force that drives life forward. Nietzsche urged men to see through this performance, to recognize that not all affection is genuine, and not all tenderness is rooted in love. Some of it, he warned, is rooted in calculation. This wasn't a condemnation of all women. It was a spotlight on a type of femininity that society refused to talk about. Nietzsche believed that by pretending this darker side didn't exist, we only gave it more room to operate. And in doing so, we left men unprepared and disarmed, easy prey for emotional games they didn't even know they were playing. But there's a deeper layer to Nietzsche's criticism. He didn't just accuse some women of manipulation. He accused society of encouraging it. From a young age, women were taught to value beauty over truth, charm over wisdom, and subtle control over direct confrontation. Nietzsche saw this as a failure, not just of individuals, but of the entire cultural framework that shaped them. He believed women had the potential to be strong, intelligent, and powerful in their own right. But that potential was often suppressed in favor of a more socially acceptable form of influence, seduction. In this sense, Nietzsche wasn't trying to destroy femininity. He was trying to challenge its false representation. He wanted to pull the mask off the ideal, to show that what we call feminine charm is sometimes a disguised form of control. And he wanted men to stop falling for it, not because he hated women, but because he hated weakness, deception, and the slow corrosion of personal power. Society, however, ignored his warning. They preferred the fantasy. They preferred a world where these dynamics could remain unspoken, where seduction could remain innocent, and where power games could be played in the shadows. But Nietzsche believed that only by bringing these truths into the light could we create relationships based on honesty, not illusion, and strength, not submission. When Friedrich Nietzsche introduced the concept of the will to power, he wasn't merely referring to brute strength or political domination. To Nietzsche, the will to power was the fundamental driving force behind all life, more basic than survival or pleasure. Every living being, he believed, is striving to assert itself, to shape the world in its image, and to overcome resistance. This drive can take on many forms: physical, intellectual, spiritual, or emotional. But crucially, Nietzsche believed that men and women, though both governed by the will to power, expressed it in radically different ways. For men, power was often pursued openly, through ambition, conquest, invention, and leadership. For women, Nietzsche argued, power could be more veiled, more psychologically nuanced. He suggested that some women, constrained by social norms that denied them direct access to political or economic authority, developed alternative means of influence. These methods weren't necessarily less potent, they were just less visible. Seduction, emotional manipulation, and the ability to control the inner emotional world of men became tools for survival, and eventually, for dominance. Nietzsche saw this not as a flaw in women, but as a kind of adaptive brilliance. However, he also warned that this form of power, because it masqueraded as vulnerability, could be especially dangerous. A woman who understood how to control her environment not through force but through suggestion, implication, and emotional leverage was, in his eyes, often far more capable of shaping reality than any tyrant or general. This is the kind of insight that disturbed many who read Nietzsche. It was not the crude misogyny of a bitter man, but a sophisticated critique of power that recognized how society often mislabels and misunderstands the female expression of dominance. Nietzsche was struck by how some women could wield enormous control without ever appearing to seek it. A well-timed tear, a glance, a sudden withdrawal of affection. These could shift a man's entire mood, redirect his decisions, or even derail his ambitions. He believed this wasn't accidental. It was a subconscious, perhaps even instinctive form of strategic behavior, honed through centuries of navigating a male-dominated world. But Nietzsche didn't romanticize this adaptation. He saw it as corrosive, not just to men, but to women themselves. When power is pursued through subtlety and disguise, Nietzsche believed, it becomes entangled with deception, and deception, even when effective, comes at a cost. A person who consistently uses manipulation as a tool begins to lose authenticity. Over time, they may become trapped in their own performance, unable to be truly vulnerable or truthful. Nietzsche feared that society encouraged this in women, that it rewarded charm over character, cunning over courage, and in doing so, it denied women the chance to fully realize their own potential as creators and thinkers. To Nietzsche, true power wasn't about control over others. It was about self-overcoming. And in this sense, both men and women were losing. Men were losing themselves in illusions of romantic submission, and women were losing themselves in strategies of subtle domination. The tragic irony in Nietzsche's eyes was that the very people society called strong were often the most imprisoned by their roles, and the ones who could have been powerful in a deeper sense were seduced by the false comfort of surface-level influence. Nietzsche's message was stark and unapologetic. The will to power is universal, but its expression must be made conscious. If not, it twists into something dark, hidden, manipulative, and destructive. By failing to confront how the will to power manifests in different forms, especially in relationships, society continues to walk blindly into dysfunction, mistaking control for love and domination for devotion. Nietzsche's philosophy often focused on the idea of morality being used as a weapon. He believed that what society calls good is often just a disguise for weakness, a set of values invented by those who cannot dominate physically and who instead use morality to shame and restrain the strong. This is what he called slave morality, a value system born not out of strength or creativity, but out of resentment and fear. And in some of his most provocative writings, Nietzsche suggests that this same dynamic can be found in how certain women, and even wider cultural patterns around femininity, manipulate through victimhood. In his view, playing the victim is not always a sign of genuine suffering. Sometimes it is a strategy, a deliberate choice to occupy the moral high ground, to generate sympathy, and to neutralize opposition. The victim cannot be criticized. The victim must be protected. And in a world increasingly obsessed with moral purity, this strategy becomes immensely powerful. Nietzsche was disturbed by this. He saw it as a corruption of truth, a way of turning weakness into a form of silent aggression. In relationships, Nietzsche believed that this form of moral manipulation could be devastating. A woman, or indeed anyone, who consistently casts themselves as the wounded, the misunderstood, the oppressed, regardless of the actual power they wield, can slowly undermine their partner's sense of agency. The man becomes the aggressor by default, the one who must always apologize, always concede, always yield. Over time, this dynamic saps his vitality. He begins to fear conflict, to second-guess himself, to walk on eggshells. This, Nietzsche warned, is the subtle tyranny of moral blackmail. Nietzsche was not denying the reality of genuine suffering or oppression. Rather, he was pointing to a specific psychological pattern where a person discovers that they can gain power not by being strong, but by appearing wounded. It's a reversal of natural hierarchy. Instead of being admired for courage or excellence, one is rewarded for pain. The more one suffers or claims to suffer, the more virtue they are assigned. Nietzsche found this deeply unhealthy. In his mind, it discouraged growth. It trapped people in their lowest states, because rising above them would mean losing their advantage. He argued that this cultural glorification of victimhood eventually distorts both personal relationships and social structures. In romantic partnerships, it fosters a codependent cycle where one person plays the martyr and the other the oppressor, even if the roles are entirely constructed. In society, it leads to a kind of moral inflation, where victim narratives are multiplied and weaponized, drowning out genuine injustice under layers of performance. Nietzsche's critique wasn't just about manipulation, it was about the death of authenticity. When people learn to speak from a place of woundedness because it offers rewards, the line between real pain and performative suffering disappears. Compassion is replaced by suspicion. Empathy becomes a tool for control rather than connection. And this, Nietzsche feared, would lead to a society where truth itself becomes suspect and power is held not by the honest, but by the most convincing victim. This was perhaps one of Nietzsche's most prophetic insights. In a culture where moral narratives dominate everything from politics to personal identity, the use of victimhood as power has only become more refined. Nietzsche was not condemning the weak. He was condemning the use of weakness as a mask for domination. And in doing so, he was calling for a return to honesty, to strength rooted in self-awareness, not in manipulation. He wanted both men and women to rise above this dynamic, to stop using pain as currency, and instead strive for inner strength even when it's difficult. In his world, to suffer and still choose truth, dignity, and responsibility was the highest act of power. Anything else, no matter how emotionally persuasive, was just another form of spiritual decay. Friedrich Nietzsche was not merely a philosopher of his time. He was a prophet of uncomfortable truths, many of which society has yet to truly confront. Among those truths, perhaps none was more provocatively ignored than his observations about the subtle dynamics of power between men and women. While much of the outrage against Nietzsche centers around his more inflammatory statements, what many fail to realize is that beneath his sharp, even brutal language was a call to awaken, a call that went largely unheeded. What modern society refused to learn from Nietzsche was not a simple lesson about gender roles or romantic relationships. It was a far deeper message about the psychological games people play, the illusions they maintain, and the spiritual cost of avoiding reality. Nietzsche saw through the masks people wore, especially in love. He warned of the cost of worshipping false idols, particularly the dangerous idealization of femininity. He saw how certain social systems encouraged both men and women to adopt inauthentic roles, turning relationships into carefully staged performances, rather than mutual engagements between strong, honest individuals. In today's world, the very patterns Nietzsche identified have not vanished, they've evolved. Emotional manipulation is no longer whispered about. It's often celebrated in pop culture, cloaked under terms like feminine power or main character energy. The idea of using charm, silence, or vulnerability as tools of influence is portrayed as clever, even empowering. But Nietzsche would ask, empowering for whom, and at what cost? The romanticized version of the self-sacrificing woman who gains control through emotional leverage, and the man who willingly submits to this for fear of conflict, loneliness, or the loss of affection, has become even more widespread. The dynamics Nietzsche described are now deeply embedded in modern relationship culture, but no one dares question them because they are wrapped in moral language. To critique them is to risk being labeled heartless, misogynistic, or regressive. Yet Nietzsche was not against women. He was against dishonesty. He believed that true power, real, lasting, life-affirming power, came from self-knowledge, not manipulation. But this requires courage. And courage is in short supply in a society that rewards people not for facing themselves, but for playing roles that win social approval. The woman who is encouraged to see her emotional vulnerability as a bargaining chip rather than a path to deeper self-awareness is being robbed of her potential. The man who idealizes women instead of engaging with them as equals is setting himself up for disillusionment, dependency, and quiet resentment. Nietzsche's brutal honesty was meant to liberate. He wanted individuals, regardless of gender, to free themselves from the roles that culture imposed. He saw that some women, pushed into a corner by a male-dominated society, learned to survive through more covert forms of control. But instead of glorifying this adaptation, he mourned it. He believed that both sexes were being deformed by a culture of deception. A woman who is not free to express her power openly is not free at all, and a man who fears truth because it might cost him comfort is already enslaved. Modern feminism, pop psychology, and relationship advice all too often ignore this deeper dynamic. They focus on surface-level empowerment, confidence, status, attractiveness, but rarely do they address the inner warfare of power and weakness, the ways in which people are still encouraged to manipulate rather than grow. Nietzsche would ask, why do so few seek truth in their relationships? Why do so many prefer a partner who flatters their ego instead of challenging their soul? He would not be surprised that society still hasn't answered. His whole life was a war against cowardice, moral, spiritual, and intellectual. He believed that the reason no one listened to his truths about women, love, and power was because these truths required people to see themselves clearly. And that, for most, is too terrifying. It's easier to dismiss Nietzsche than to confront how much we've built our identities on illusions, how many of our relationships are based on emotional bargains rather than authentic connection. In the end, Nietzsche's warning is not about women or men alone. It's about all of us. How we've traded honesty for comfort, truth for fantasy, and mutual growth for subtle power games. He saw the rot beneath the surface, and he named it. Not because he hated life, but because he wanted to cleanse it. His philosophy is a fire meant to burn away deception, and that includes the most sacred lies we tell ourselves about love, vulnerability, and virtue. So when society refused to listen to Nietzsche, it wasn't just ignoring a philosopher, it was rejecting a mirror that showed us how much we hide, how deeply we fear truth, and how easily we are seduced by the performance of goodness rather than the difficult work of becoming whole. And that refusal has left us in a culture where emotional power is still mistaken for emotional depth, where victimhood can be weaponized, and where relationships are often more about control than connection. Nietzsche's brutal truths are not easy to hear, but perhaps that's why they matter more than ever.